Ethan stepped into the dilapidated amusement park, the creak of the rusted gate echoing through the desolate grounds. The air was thick with a mix of damp earth and decaying wood, accompanied by an odd, metallic tang that clung to his senses. Ahead of him stood the centerpiece of the park, a grand carousel, its once vibrant colors now faded to ghostly hues of gray and beige. The chipped paint revealed splinters beneath, and the horses, frozen mid-gallop, seemed to be straining against invisible reins. Their glassy eyes shimmered in the faint moonlight, as if following his every move. The silence was deafening, broken only by the occasional groan of the wind pushing through forgotten structures. As Ethan approached the carousel, an unsettling sensation began to creep up his spine. The air grew colder, unnaturally so, and with each step, the surrounding darkness seemed to close in, swallowing the faint light of the moon. His breath came in shallow bursts, visible in the frosty air, as though the park itself was exhaling its despair. A faint melody whispered through the night, carried on the wind, a haunting tune from a broken music box. It was distant yet piercing, pulling Ethan closer to the carousel. He stopped abruptly, his instincts screaming at him to turn back. But curiosity, or perhaps something more sinister, compelled him forward. As he reached the carousel, he noticed a faint shimmer on the surface of the horses. Their wooden forms seemed to shift under the flickering light, their shadows moving unnaturally as if alive. Then he saw it. One of the horses, a black steed with a twisted snarl carved into its face, seemed to tremble ever so slightly. Ethan blinked, convinced it was his imagination, but when he opened his eyes, the horse's head was turned toward him. Its teeth, unnaturally sharp for a wooden figure, glistened as if wet. A cold sweat broke out across Ethan's skin, and his hands instinctively clenched into fists. He backed away, but the carousel groaned to life, creaking as it began to spin ever so slowly. Ethan's heart thundered in his chest as the music grew louder, the once innocent tune now warped and discordant. The horses moved, their frozen gallops turning into unsettling, jerky strides as if they were trying to free themselves. Shadows danced wildly around him, and the air filled with an oppressive weight, like 1,000 unseen eyes were watching him from the darkness. And then it happened. A whisper, low and guttural, echoed from the carousel. It wasn't the wind, nor the creaking of wood. It was something else entirely. "Ethan," it hissed, drawing his name out like a sinister lullaby. He spun around, searching for the source, but he was alone, or so it seemed. The black horse now loomed closer, its body twisting as though it were breaking free from its wooden prison. Ethan stumbled back, his foot catching on a loose board, sending him crashing to the ground. The carousel's lights flickered violently, casting eerie shadows that seemed to come alive, stretching and contorting into grotesque shapes. A hollow laugh, distorted and otherworldly, erupted from nowhere, filling the air with a sound that made Ethan's blood run cold. He scrambled to his feet, but the ground beneath him felt unstable, as if the park itself was rejecting his presence. Just as he turned to flee, the carousel screeched to a halt, the music cutting off abruptly. Silence enveloped the park once more, but the oppressive feeling remained. Ethan's eyes darted back to the carousel, and he froze in terror. The black horse was now entirely off its platform, standing at the edge of the carousel with its head tilted unnaturally to the side, staring directly at him. Its eyes, once lifeless glass, now burned with a faint, sinister glow. Behind him, a faint whisper brushed against his ear, cold and unmistakable. "You shouldn't have come here." Ethan staggered away from the carousel, his breathing ragged, his mind racing with questions. The chill in the air seemed to burrow into his bones as if the very ground beneath the park had a pulse, slow, deliberate, and ominous. Seeking refuge, he stumbled into the operator's booth nearby. The cracked glass windows allowed moonlight to spill in, casting jagged shadows across the room. Dust hung in the air, illuminated by the faint light, and the scent of mildew mixed with something more unsettling, something metallic like blood long dried. His hands trembled as he fumbled with the latch of a drawer, desperate for answers. Inside, he found a weathered photograph album, its cover warped and stained. He hesitated, his instincts warning him not to open it, but an inexplicable pull drove him forward. As he flipped through the brittle pages, his breath caught. The images were old, faded, but eerily familiar. A carousel, gleaming and new, stood in the center of the photos. Children laughed and smiled, their faces full of joy, except for their eyes. Ethan leaned closer, squinting. The eyes of every child in the photographs were black, voids that seemed to stare directly into him. His stomach turned, and he slammed the album shut. But as he did, something slipped out from between the pages. A torn corner of a photograph fluttered to the ground. He picked it up and froze. The fragment showed a boy, no older than 5, standing beside the carousel. The child's face was his own. Memories, fractured and disjointed, flooded Ethan's mind like an onslaught of whispers. He saw himself as a child, wandering away from his parents in a carnival long ago. He remembered the lights of the carousel glowing unnaturally bright, the music pulling him closer. A voice, soft, maternal, yet dripping with malice, had whispered his name, luring him to the ride. He had climbed onto a black horse, its surface warm and pulsing beneath his hands. And then darkness. Snapping back to the present, Ethan stumbled backward, knocking over a shelf. The crash echoed in the stillness, but it wasn't the noise that made his heart stop, it was what lay beneath the shelf. A child's shoe, small and pristine, rested in the dust as if untouched by time. Beside it, a stuffed bear, one eye missing, sat upright, its button nose stained dark red. Ethan recognized the bear immediately. It had been his, lost on that fateful day. Suddenly, the air in the booth grew heavy, oppressive. The faint sound of the carousel's melody began again, this time softer, more distant, like it was calling to him from across the years. Ethan's pulse quickened as he realized it wasn't just his memories that connected him to this place. Something in the park remembered him, too. Something had waited for his return. The booth's shadows began to shift, stretching unnaturally long. A child's giggle, faint and warped, echoed in the small space. Ethan turned, his back pressing against the wall, but no one was there. His reflection in the cracked window caught his eye, and he froze. It wasn't his face staring back at him. It was the face of the boy in the photograph, his younger self, eyes wide and empty, a haunting smile stretching across his pale features. The reflection mouthed a single word, "Run." But Ethan couldn't move. His legs felt like lead as the sound of approaching footsteps reverberated behind him. They were light, almost playful, but carried a weight that made the floorboards creak ominously. Turning slowly, he saw nothing, just the darkened doorway leading back to the carousel. Yet the footsteps continued, circling him, growing louder. The final page of the album lay open on the floor, fluttering as if caught in a breeze that didn't exist. Ethan forced himself to pick it up, drawn to the image despite his fear. The photograph showed the carousel at night, the horses illuminated by an eerie glow. But it wasn't the ride that sent chills through his spine, it was the children. They stood around the carousel, staring directly into the camera. Their faces were pale, their expressions vacant, and their eyes black as voids. At the center of the photo was a woman, her face obscured by a veil. She held the hand of a small boy, Ethan's younger self. Written below the photo in spidery handwriting were the words, "Welcome home, Ethan." The carousel's melody grew louder, more distorted, as if summoning him. Ethan knew now that this was no coincidence. His childhood, the lost memories, the park, it was all connected. The carousel wasn't just a ride, it was a trap, a beacon for the lost, and somehow, Ethan had escaped it once. But whatever dwelled within hadn't forgotten, and now it wanted him back. Ethan's steps faltered as he approached the carousel, its sinister melody pulling him forward like an invisible chain. The horses stood eerily still now, their glassy eyes fixed on him, as if they had been waiting for this moment. His mind raced with fragmented thoughts, but an oppressive weight seemed to bear down on him, clouding his ability to think clearly. The air grew colder, each breath visible in the freezing mist that clung to the park. The whispers began again, faint at first like the rustling of leaves, but soon growing louder, forming incoherent words that sent shivers down his spine. As he neared the carousel, the black horse that had unnerved him earlier appeared to shift again, its body subtly turning to face him. The air seemed to hum with energy, and the whispers coalesced into a single voice, soft, female, yet dripping with malice. "You've returned, Ethan, but not as you were. Choose, and we will let you go." Before he could comprehend the words, the carousel jerked into motion, spinning slowly at first but picking up speed. The lights flickered erratically, casting distorted shadows that danced like phantoms around him. Suddenly, the ride screeched to a halt, and the music warped into a chilling, discordant tune. Ethan stumbled back as a figure emerged from the shadows, a woman clad in a tattered dress, her face hidden beneath a dark veil. Her presence radiated an unnatural cold that seeped into his bones. In her hands, she held a tarnished mirror, its surface cracked and streaked with what appeared to be dried blood. She extended it toward him, and as he gazed into its depths, he saw two reflections, one of himself as he was now, and another of the small boy he had once been, clutching the stuffed bear he had found in the booth. The boy's eyes were hollow, his face twisted in fear. The whispers intensified, and the woman's voice cut through the cacophony. "Choose, Ethan. The past or the present?" The carousel's horses began to move, their wooden bodies jerking unnaturally, as if struggling against invisible reins. Their eyes burned with an unnatural light, and their mouths opened wide, emitting guttural, inhuman sounds. Ethan's heart pounded as he realized the stakes of the choice before him. If he touched the mirror, he could reclaim his lost memories, but the voice warned that doing so would anchor him to the park forever. Alternatively, he could destroy the carousel's control panel, severing its hold over him, but at the cost of unleashing whatever malevolence lingered here into the world beyond. The ground beneath him trembled, and the air was filled with the distant cries of children, their voices filled with anguish. Ethan's mind raced, torn between the life he barely remembered and the horrors he might unleash by choosing freedom. The black horse reared violently, its wooden hooves striking the ground with a thunderous crack, as if urging him to act. He turned toward the control panel, a rusted box near the base of the carousel. Its wires sparked with erratic bursts of electricity, and a single, red switch flickered ominously. Destroying it could end this nightmare, but the price of his ignorance, of never understanding what had drawn him here, gnawed at him. He glanced back at the mirror, and the reflection of the child seemed to plead silently, its hand reaching out from within the glass. The veiled woman stood motionless, her presence suffocating yet patient, as if she knew he couldn't decide. Ethan clenched his fists, his breath ragged. The whispers turned to screams, the carousel spinning faster, the shadows growing longer and more menacing. The world around him blurred, the boundaries of reality seeming to dissolve. The choice was his, but no matter what he decided, he knew there would be no peace, not tonight, and perhaps not ever. "Choose," the voice bellowed, echoing through the park like a thunderclap. Ethan reached forward, his hand trembling as he hovered between the mirror and the control panel, his reflection in the glass twisting into something unrecognizable, a monstrous visage of fear, regret, and longing. As the seconds stretched into eternity, he realized the truth. Whatever he chose, the park had already claimed him. Ethan's hand froze midair, torn between the mirror and the control panel. Suddenly, the world around him shifted. The carousel lights flickered violently before plunging the park into an eerie darkness, lit only by the faint glow of the crescent moon. The silence was suffocating, broken only by the sound of his own labored breathing. Then, from the depths of the shadows, came the whisper, a soft, rasping voice that slithered into his ears like the hiss of a snake. "Ethan, you belong here." The voice seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, wrapping around him like invisible tendrils. Ethan spun around, his eyes darting frantically across the gloom, but the source of the voice remained elusive. The carousel was now completely still, its once glimmering horses shrouded in darkness. Yet, the feeling of being watched grew unbearable. He felt the weight of unseen eyes pressing on him, their gaze cold and unrelenting. Suddenly, the shadows themselves began to writhe, twisting and coalescing into grotesque forms. Faces, half-formed and hollow, emerged from the darkness, their mouths stretching unnaturally wide as they whispered his name in unison. Ethan stumbled back, his foot catching on a loose plank. He hit the ground hard, the impact knocking the air from his lungs. When he looked up, one of the shadowy faces was mere inches from his own, its empty sockets gazing into him as if searching his very soul. A faint breeze stirred, carrying with it the scent of decay. Ethan recoiled as the whispers grew louder, blending into a cacophony of incoherent words and distorted laughter. The shadows seemed alive now, creeping closer with every passing second. Desperately, he scrambled to his feet, his mind racing for a way out. But the park felt endless, its boundaries swallowed by the oppressive darkness. The whispers grew more distinct, transforming into fragments of sentences that made his blood run cold. "You left us. Why didn't you stay?" "We waited." The words carried a weight of sorrow and malice, as if spoken by forgotten voices lost to time. Ethan's chest tightened as he realized their source, the children. The same children from the photographs, their faces blank, their eyes black voids. Their whispers tugged at something deep within him, a guilt he couldn't fully understand. As he backed away, his gaze fell on the carousel once more. The black horse stood at its edge, its body glistening as if coated in a slick, viscous substance. Its head twisted slowly, impossibly, until it faced him directly. The faint glow in its eyes had intensified, burning with a malevolent intelligence. Ethan froze as the horse opened its mouth, revealing rows of jagged, human-like teeth. From its gaping maw came a low, guttural growl, a sound that resonated deep in his chest and sent a primal terror coursing through his veins. The shadows around the carousel thickened, rising like smoke and forming a swirling vortex. In the center of the maelstrom stood a figure, taller and more defined than the others. It was the veiled woman, her presence commanding and oppressive. Her veil fluttered as if caught in a phantom wind, and beneath it, Ethan caught glimpses of her face, distorted and shifting, as though she were not one being but many. Her voice pierced through the whispers, calm yet filled with menace. "You abandoned them, Ethan. Now they are mine. But you have a choice." The vortex of shadows began to expand, the faces within it screaming silently as they clawed at the edges. The ground beneath Ethan trembled, cracks spiderwebbing outward from the carousel. The shadows reached for him, tendrils of darkness brushing against his skin, cold and hungry. His pulse thundered in his ears as he fought the urge to run, knowing instinctively that there was nowhere to go. The woman raised her hand, and the whispers fell silent. In the sudden stillness, she extended a long, bony finger, pointing directly at Ethan. "Your past or your freedom," she intoned, her voice reverberating through the park like a death knell. "But be warned, freedom comes with a price." The shadows surged forward, encircling Ethan in a suffocating embrace. He struggled, his vision blurring as he gasped for air. The whispers returned, louder and more frantic, as if the voices were pleading with him now. In the corner of his eye, he saw the mirror lying shattered on the ground, its fractured surface reflecting his terrified face. The control panel sparked violently, its red switch glowing like a beacon in the darkness. As the shadows tightened their grip, Ethan felt a cold, spectral hand brush against his cheek. A child's voice, trembling and filled with despair, whispered in his ear, "Don't leave us again." His knees buckled under the weight of the choice before him. Every fiber of his being screamed for him to act, but the terror held him paralyzed. The carousel began to creak back to life, spinning slowly as the distorted music returned, its haunting melody filling the night. Ethan knew his time was running out. Whatever he chose, he would never leave this park unchanged. And the shadows, patient and insidious, waited eagerly for him to decide. The carousel's haunting melody twisted the air around Ethan, each note clawing at his sanity. The shadows that had enveloped him moments ago retreated slightly, as if giving him space to breathe, but not to escape. The oppressive darkness seemed alive, pulsating with a rhythm that matched his pounding heartbeat. His mind felt like a labyrinth, each corner brimming with fear and confusion. Yet, something deeper began to stir within him, a creeping temptation to give in, to let the terror consume him and end the unbearable tension. The carousel groaned, its horses jerking in unnatural movements, their wooden faces warping as if caught mid-scream. Ethan's eyes darted to the black horse, its malevolent gaze locked on him, its body unnervingly lifelike. A faint, distorted voice whispered from its direction, barely audible over the carousel's warped tune. "Fear will show you the truth," it hissed. The words slithered into his mind, bypassing logic, igniting a flicker of curiosity he couldn't suppress. The air grew colder, and a dense fog began to roll in, coiling around his legs and stretching like ghostly fingers across the ground. As the fog thickened, Ethan began to see shapes within it, visions materializing in the haze. They were fragments of memories, twisted and wrong, flickering like an old film reel. He saw himself as a child, running through a brightly lit carnival. But the joyous laughter he should have remembered was absent, replaced by the faint, echoing cries of children calling his name. The fog shifted, and the scene changed. Ethan stood before a small, wooden house, its windows shattered, the door creaking open as though inviting him in. He recognized the house immediately. It was his childhood home. But something was off. The walls seemed to breathe, expanding and contracting with a sickening rhythm. The faint silhouette of his mother appeared at the doorway, her arm outstretched. "Come back, Ethan," she said, her voice layered with anguish and something darker. Her face was obscured by shadow, but her eyes glowed faintly, an unnatural, pale light that froze him in place. Ethan turned away, shaking his head, but the fog thickened again, wrapping around him like a cocoon. This time, he was inside the house, standing in the middle of a room he hadn't thought of in years. The wallpaper was peeling, revealing blackened wood beneath. The air was thick with the scent of rot, and the floorboards groaned under his weight. In the corner of the room sat a small rocking chair, its rhythmic creak piercing the silence. On the chair was the stuffed bear he had found earlier, but now its missing eye glowed faintly, staring at him as if alive. As he approached the bear, the rocking chair stopped abruptly, and the whispers returned, louder and more insistent. They came from the walls, the floor, the air itself, each voice weaving into the next. "You left us," one cried. "You belong here. another pleaded. Ethan's breath quickened, his vision blurring as the room began to spin. The whispers twisted into screams, and his knees buckled under the weight of the noise. He pressed his hands to his ears, but it did nothing to block out the sound. Suddenly, everything went silent. The fog dissipated in an instant, and Ethan found himself back in the park, kneeling before the carousel. The black horse loomed over him, its eyes burning brighter now, illuminating the streaks of tears on his face. The carousel spun slowly, each turn revealing new horrors, glimpses of the children from the photographs, their hollow faces peering out from the darkness. They reached toward him with skeletal hands, their mouths moving silently, as if begging for release. Ethan's mind teetered on the edge of collapse. His fear twisted into something more insidious, temptation. The whispers from the carousel grew softer, more alluring, promising answers if he just surrendered. Embrace it, they urged. The fear will show you everything you've forgotten. For a fleeting moment, he considered it. What if the terror held the key to understanding? What if the fear wasn't his enemy but his guide? But then the carousel jolted violently, snapping him from his thoughts. The shadows around him surged forward, licking at his feet, their icy tendrils wrapping tightly around his legs. He tried to move, but his body was paralyzed, held captive by the oppressive darkness. The whispers returned, louder now, almost deafening. Do you see it now, Ethan? The voice hissed. The truth lies in the fear. Give in, and it will all be over. The carousel lights flared one last time, illuminating the faces of the wooden horses. Each one now bore the likeness of a child, their expressions frozen in agony. Ethan's heart clenched as he realized the carousel wasn't just a ride, it was a prison, a monument to the lost, to those who had succumbed to the park's malevolence. And it wanted him to join them. The shadows pulled harder, dragging him closer to the spinning ride. His mind screamed for him to fight, to resist, but his body felt heavy, weighed down by an unseen force. As the whispers grew into a crescendo, he felt the cold, skeletal touch of a hand on his shoulder. Turning slowly, he came face to face with the veiled woman once more. Her voice cut through the chaos, calm and commanding. The truth has a price, Ethan. Are you ready to pay it? Torn between the fear that sought to claim him and the faint spark of hope that he could escape, Ethan closed his eyes, knowing that whatever choice he made would change him forever. Ethan stood frozen, the icy grip of the shadows tightening around him. The carousel's haunting melody grew louder, twisting into a cacophony of distorted notes and faint screams. The world around him felt fractured, as though reality itself had been shattered and stitched back together by something monstrous. The veiled woman's presence loomed over him, her voice cutting through the chaos like a blade. The truth lies within, Ethan. But the truth will consume you. The ground beneath him trembled, cracks spiderwebbing outward from the carousel, glowing faintly with an unnatural light. The black horse stepped down from its platform, its hooves striking the ground with a sickening, fleshy thud. Its glowing eyes bore into Ethan, and its mouth twisted into a grotesque grin. The horse was no longer a mere carving. Its body writhed as though something alive struggled to escape its wooden frame. It began to circle him, its movements slow and deliberate, like a predator savoring its prey. Ethan's gaze darted toward the control panel, the red switch pulsing like a heartbeat. If he could just destroy it, maybe he could end this nightmare. But the mirror lying in shards at his feet reflected something he couldn't ignore. A boy, no older than 5, standing among the shadows. The child's face was pale, his eyes dark and sunken, but unmistakably Ethan's own. The boy raised a trembling hand, pointing toward the carousel. A flood of memories crashed over Ethan, fragments of his childhood that had been buried for decades. He remembered the carnival, the lights, and the music that had drawn him to the carousel so many years ago. He remembered climbing onto the black horse, its surface warm and pulsing under his hands. But what came after was a blur of fear and pain, as if something had reached into his mind and taken a piece of him. And now, standing before him, was the piece he had lost, a fragment of his soul, trapped in the carousel's grasp. The veiled woman stepped forward, her movements unnaturally smooth, as though she glided across the ground. She extended her hand, and the carousel slowed to a stop. The lights dimmed, leaving only the faint glow of the cracks in the ground to illuminate the scene. Her voice was soft, almost gentle, but carried a weight that made Ethan's chest tighten. "You've come to take him back," she said, gesturing to the boy. "But the price is steep, Ethan. To free him, you must take his place." Ethan's heart pounded as he processed her words. The carousel, the whispers, the shadows, they weren't just tormenting him. They were feeding on him, pulling him into their world. If he chose to save the boy, he would be forever bound to the park, a part of its cursed machinery. But if he destroyed the control panel, he might escape, at the cost of leaving that part of himself behind, lost to the darkness forever. The boy stepped closer, his bare feet silent on the cracked ground. Tears streamed down his pale cheeks, and he whispered in a voice so faint it was barely audible, "Don't leave me here." Ethan's knees buckled, the weight of the choice crushing him. The shadows around him twisted and writhed, their forms shifting into grotesque faces that mocked and pleaded with him in equal measure. The black horse reared, its jagged teeth snapping as it let out a guttural roar, the sound reverberating through the park like a thunderclap. Ethan clenched his fists, his breath ragged. The whispers returned, louder now, as if the park itself was alive, urging him to decide. "Choose, Ethan," the veiled woman said, her voice both a command and a plea. "Choose, or the carousel will choose for you." He looked at the boy, at his own reflection in those hollow eyes, and then at the control panel. His mind screamed with the impossibility of the decision. If he saved the boy, would he lose himself entirely? If he left him behind, would he ever be whole again? The cracks in the ground widened, glowing brighter, and the carousel began to spin once more, faster and faster, its music a deafening crescendo. Ethan took a trembling step forward, his hand outstretched. The boy reached for him, their fingers inches apart. The veiled woman tilted her head, as if observing a long-anticipated moment. "This is your truth, Ethan," she said, "and it will be your end." With a final surge of resolve, Ethan made his choice. As his fingers brushed against the boy's hand, a blinding light erupted from the carousel, and the ground beneath him gave way. He was swallowed by the shadows, his screams lost in the cacophony of the ride's sinister melody. The park trembled violently, the cracks consuming everything in their path, until there was nothing left but silence. And when the silence settled, the carousel stood still once more, its horses frozen in mid-gallop. In the faint glow of the moonlight, a new figure stood among them, a man with a familiar face, his eyes hollow, his expression one of eternal sorrow. The veiled woman watched from the shadows, her lips curling into a faint smile. "Welcome home, Ethan," she whispered, before fading into the darkness. The world around Ethan was chaos. The carousel spun wildly, its grotesque horses blurring into a swirling storm of light and shadow. The ground beneath him trembled as fissures spread, emitting a sickly glow that pulsed like a heartbeat. The whispers had transformed into screams, high-pitched and layered with anguish, as if the park itself was alive and crying out in torment. Ethan stood at the center of it all, his chest heaving, his mind teetering on the brink of collapse. The veiled woman stood motionless before him, her presence both commanding and suffocating. Her voice cut through the cacophony like a blade, calm but filled with menace. "You've come this far, Ethan. Now prove your worth." The carousel jolted to a halt with a deafening screech, and the shadows coalesced into towering forms around him. They were no longer vague specters, but figures of terrifying clarity. Children with hollow eyes and twisted smiles, their hands stretched toward him. Their whispers, now more distinct, carried accusations that pierced his soul. "You left us," they said, their voices trembling with sorrow and malice. "Why did you forget?" Ethan's breath caught as the boy, the fragment of himself he had seen, emerged from the shadows. The child's pale face was streaked with tears, but his eyes were lifeless, two black voids that seemed to devour the light. "You abandoned me," the boy whispered, his voice cracking with despair. "And now you're here to finish what you started." Before Ethan could respond, the carousel roared back to life, spinning faster than before. The black horse reared up, its jagged teeth bared, and let out a guttural scream that reverberated through the park. The air around Ethan grew heavy, pressing down on him like an invisible weight. The shadows surged forward, clawing at him with icy tendrils, their touch burning his skin with a cold so intense it felt like fire. The veiled woman raised her hands, and the shadows recoiled, retreating into the cracks in the ground. "This is your moment, Ethan," she said, her voice both alluring and terrifying. "You can face the truth or let it consume you. But you cannot run." Ethan's eyes darted between the carousel, the boy, and the woman. His mind raced, searching for a way out, but every path seemed to lead back to the same conclusion. He couldn't escape without confronting whatever darkness had tethered him to this cursed place. Summoning what little courage he had left, he stepped toward the boy, his voice trembling. "I didn't mean to leave you," he said. "I didn't know." The boy's lips curled into a bitter smile, but his eyes remained empty. "It doesn't matter," he replied. "You still did." The carousel shuddered violently, its wooden horses breaking free from their platforms. They moved with jerky, unnatural motions, their bodies twisting and contorting as though something inside them was trying to escape. The black horse led the charge, galloping toward Ethan with an unholy speed. He dove out of the way, narrowly avoiding its crushing hooves. The ground where it landed splintered, sending shards of wood and dirt flying into the air. Ethan scrambled to his feet, his pulse pounding in his ears. The other horses followed, circling him like predators closing in on their prey. Their eyes glowed with a malevolent light, and their mouths twisted into grotesque snarls. He could hear their breath, heavy, labored, and far too real for wooden constructs. The veiled woman's voice rang out above the chaos. "The carousel demands its due, Ethan. Face it, or let it claim you." Desperation surged through him as he realized he had only one chance. His eyes locked onto the control panel, its red switch flickering like a dying ember. If he could reach it, he might be able to stop this madness. But the boy stepped into his path, blocking his way. "You can't leave," the boy said, his voice breaking. "Not again." Ethan hesitated, torn between the child and the control panel. The boy reached out, his small hand trembling, and Ethan saw the pain etched into his face. "If you go, I'll be lost forever," the boy whispered. "You'll be whole, but I'll be gone." Behind him, the carousel spun faster, the horses closing in. The black horse reared again, letting out another ear-splitting scream. The ground shook, and the shadows surged toward him like a tidal wave. Ethan's vision blurred, his thoughts fragmented by fear and guilt. The choice before him felt impossible. Save himself or save the fragment of his soul trapped in this nightmare. With a surge of resolve, Ethan reached out, grabbing the boy's hand. A blinding light erupted from the carousel, and the screams of the shadows grew deafening. The veiled woman let out a guttural laugh, her form dissolving into the swirling chaos. The boy's grip tightened, and Ethan felt a searing pain in his chest, as though something inside him was being torn apart. The light consumed everything, and for a moment, there was nothing but silence. When Ethan opened his eyes, he was standing alone in the park. The carousel was still, its lights dimmed, its horses frozen once more. The boy was gone, and so was the veiled woman. The air was heavy with an unnatural quiet, and the ground beneath him was cold and lifeless. He looked at his hands, his chest, but felt empty. Something was missing, something vital. As he turned to leave, he caught sight of his reflection in a shard of the broken mirror. His eyes, once full of fear, were now black voids, hollow and lifeless. In the distance, the carousel creaked softly, its melody faint but lingering, a haunting reminder of the price he had paid. And in the shadows, just beyond his reach, he thought he heard the boy's voice, faint and distant. "Thank you, but you're one of us now." Ethan walked away, but the whispers followed, a constant reminder that the truth may have set him free, but at a cost he would carry forever. The carousel stood silent, its haunting melody now a faint echo in Ethan's mind. The air in the park was still, yet heavy, as if the land itself held its breath. The darkness that had once engulfed the area seemed to linger at the edges, watching, waiting. Ethan staggered away from the carousel, his legs weak, his mind fractured. The oppressive weight that had gripped him moments ago was gone, but it left behind a void, an emptiness that gnawed at his soul. He glanced down at his hands, expecting to see blood or scars, but they were unmarked. Yet something felt off. His body felt alien, as if he no longer belonged to it. The park was eerily quiet now, the whispers and shadows gone, leaving only the faint sound of the wind rustling through the overgrown grass. But the silence wasn't comforting, it was oppressive, as though it were hiding something just out of sight. Ethan's gaze drifted back to the carousel. The horses were frozen mid-gallop, their wooden eyes staring blankly ahead. Yet, in the faint moonlight, he swore he saw one of them, a black horse with jagged teeth, shift slightly, as if it had been watching him. He blinked, and the horse was still again, its menacing presence lingering in his mind like a phantom. He took a step back, his breath catching in his throat. Something wasn't right. The park seemed different now. The once familiar layout of the paths and rides had shifted, the landmarks subtly distorted as though the park itself was alive, reshaping its boundaries to trap him. Ethan's heart raced as he realized he had no idea which direction led to the exit. The towering gate he had entered through was nowhere to be seen. Instead, the paths spiraled endlessly into the darkness, looping back to the carousel at every turn. His pulse quickened as the air grew colder, the frost creeping along the ground, crackling under his feet. He reached into his pocket for his phone, desperate to call for help, but the screen was blank, reflecting his pale face. Only now did he notice the change in his eyes. Once brown, they now glinted with an unnatural blackness, faint and swirling like an abyss. Panic surged through him as he dropped the phone, the device shattering on the ground. The faint sound of a child's laughter drifted through the air, light and distant. Ethan spun around, searching for the source, but the park was empty. The laughter grew louder, echoing through the stillness, bouncing off the rusted rides and crumbling booths. His chest tightened as he remembered the boy, the fragment of himself he had fought to save. "Is it you?" he called out, his voice cracking. "Where are you?" The laughter stopped abruptly, replaced by the faint creak of the carousel. It wasn't spinning, but the platform rocked gently, the horses shifting ever so slightly. The black horse at the center seemed to lean forward, its gaze locked on Ethan, its mouth slightly open as though about to speak. He stepped closer, unable to resist the pull of its presence. The faint glow of the cracks beneath the carousel returned, pulsating softly, and with each pulse, Ethan felt a tug deep within his chest, as if something inside him was being drawn toward it. A low voice, neither male nor female, whispered in his ear, "You never really leave." Ethan spun around, but there was no one there. The shadows at the edges of the park seemed to writhe, reaching toward him like tendrils, but never fully taking shape. He stumbled backward, his foot catching on a loose plank, sending him crashing to the ground. As he looked up, he saw the veiled woman standing at the edge of the carousel, her presence faint, like a ghostly imprint. "You paid the price," she said, her voice soft but tinged with malice. "But the park remembers. It always remembers." Ethan scrambled to his feet, his body trembling. "What do you mean?" "I freed the boy. I made my choice," he shouted, his voice echoing into the void. The woman tilted her head, her veil fluttering in an unseen breeze. "The boy is free," she replied, "but freedom comes at a cost. The carousel always takes what it is owed." Before Ethan could respond, the lights of the carousel flickered violently, casting the park into alternating shadows and blinding brightness. The laughter returned, louder and more distorted, joined by faint whispers that seemed to come from every direction. He covered his ears, but the voices penetrated his mind, filling it with fragmented memories. Faces he didn't recognize, screams that weren't his, and a deep, suffocating sorrow that seemed to have no end. When the light steadied, the veiled woman was gone, but her words lingered in the air. Ethan turned away from the carousel, determined to leave, but the paths twisted endlessly, leading him back to the same spot no matter which direction he took. Exhausted and desperate, he sat on the cold ground, his back to the carousel. The wind carried a faint whisper to him, one that sent chills down his spine. "You're part of it now." As the hours stretched on, the faint glow of dawn began to creep over the horizon. But it brought no comfort, only a realization that the park wasn't letting him go. He stood again, his body numb, and glanced at the carousel one last time. The horses were still, their menacing forms frozen in the pale light. But in their lifeless eyes, he saw something that made his heart stop. His own reflection stared back at him, empty and hollow. Ethan turned and walked into the twisting paths of the park, his mind blank, his steps heavy. Behind him, the carousel creaked softly, its haunting melody beginning again, faint but eternal. The park remained silent, save for the whispers of shadows and the soft echo of footsteps that faded into the darkness. Ethan was gone, but the park was patient. It always waited for its next visitor, for the next soul to wander too close. The carousel spun once, its horses frozen mid-gallop, and then it stopped, waiting in silence for the terror to begin again.